I've got a prostate problem. How are you there? Good. Hi.
Hi, Graham.
Nice to see you, mate.
Come on in.
I had a prostate problem. I'm going to take a leak. 3 and I know, always on time, and that's very good.
Hold on, how are you doing?
Very well.
Good.
God, it's been a long time, hasn't it? I had hoped that maybe... You remember Kay and Ducky, who used to do the ship ashore?
Yes.
I've tried to... I wrote to them, but...
Well, good afternoon. Welcome along to the Radio 390 reunion. Very pleased to be here to introduce my esteemed colleagues as a former listener to Radio 390. My name's Trevor Adams. I can only claim to be a listener to the station, no other involvement whatsoever. But I'd just like to, first of all, hand over to my colleagues just for a brief introduction about themselves. If we could start from your left with Graham. Would you like to just say a few words about yourself?
Yes, well, firstly, hi there, good people. It's a pleasure once again to attend another Radio Day. And as I sit here today with several of my colleagues from Radio 390, the memories will come flooding back, I know. It's always a pleasure to come along to an event like this. I don't have to travel very far, I just live down the road, so I can more or less walk it in about 15 minutes. But anyway, it's nice to be here.
Good stuff. Mark?
Hi there. Dames and heren, goedenavond. For those of us who met before, I was here 3 or 4 years ago for the Radio Day when I worked on Radio Caroline. Yes, you are right. I am also Mark Sloane, but I'm better known as Pat Hammerton to the Inland Revenue and other people at home. I did enjoy working on 390. It's my first radio station I worked on, and I'm delighted to come here and talk to you all about it. And I'm sure we've got some very interesting stories to tell you.
Excellent. Brian?
Yes, I'm Brian Cullingford, the original fort captain, I think. We actually started on a short-lived station called Radio KING, Radio King, which was a sort of training program for us to get up to speed, ready for the launch of the mightier Radio 390. So we, Mark and I think John at the end, we were at it right from the beginning of those days. And I'll just say the original instruction that we gave to announcers was, try and speak as though you were on the BBC home service 10 years ago.
Yes, excellent. Roger.
Yes, thank you. Roger Scott was the first of my 3 professional names. Today I'm Roger Scott and Arnold. Layne. Arnold comes in later, but I was on 390 perhaps after John, but around about the same time as Graham. So my time on 390 was after the Eve the Woman's Magazine of the Air phase, but we nonetheless were encouraged to keep personality to a minimum, which meant being personable but not too much personality. And everything was supposed to be easy listening, nothing too brassy. The program director, Peter James, loved classical music, easy listening music, wasn't so hot on pop. And Herb Arpert and the Tijuana Brass was a sort of borderline case. So I got a memo once saying, too brassy, Roger, keep it nicer. So I'll try to, if you want to ask me anything, I'll try to recreate the station from my point of view between March and July 67.
And John Stewart.
Right. I started out on King Radio using the name John Stewart. This lasted for my stay with Radio 390. We were invited by British Actors Equity to join the Actors Union as we were doing a job that you couldn't do in England without being a member. And they said, you're doing the job and you're not a member, so please join us. After a short while, I had a letter from them saying, we already have a John Stewart as a member, could you change your name? By then, I'd moved to Radio Essex and became Chris Stewart, and after that, I moved to Caroline North, where Bob Stewart worked, and our mail from listeners got mixed up and muddled, to which I said, OK, I'm the last person in, I'll change my name, and I became John Aston. So that sorts out the complication in names.
Well, I'm sure that hasn't confused you at all.
But I didn't understand it.
Now, when I listened to 390, it was largely to Mike Raven's groundbreaking rhythm and blues programme. I was obviously a teenager at the time, but Mike Raven's R&B programme wasn't instrumental or wasn't really comparable to any of the other programmes that were put out on 390. It was very much an easy listening station. Brian, perhaps you could explain how the format for the station arose from the ashes of KING.
Yes, I don't know if it was from the ashes. I think we were just moving slowly towards it, but I think Ted Albury,
Wait the mic at yourself.
Thank you. Not used to microphones. Ted Albury was our MD. I think he had very fixed views about this, and he was absolutely right. And we did develop a range that was quite extraordinary, from traditional jazz in the morning. We even had classical programs. We had children's programs. We had rhythm and blues, of course, and so on. Every facet of music was covered, but very little pop, except in our request program, which was very popular. We all enjoyed doing that because it gave us a break from the more traditional style of broadcasting. But it was a good mix, and it proved itself very quickly because we had an audience of, we believe, 2.9 million at its peak, which wasn't bad. We had this powerful signal, you see. We had when we look at the boat there with its mast, we thought, oh no, you should have seen ours. The forts were something like 90 feet high from the roof, and we built an aerial on there which I think was 290 feet on top of that. So it's a powerful aerial and a very powerful transmitter. So it was a good signal which was picked up in Manchester and Scarborough and Bristol and so on. So powerful message. Powerful message
Indeed. Perhaps I can move over to John, though, just for a moment. I've heard it said that certainly in the early days of 390, you were expected to wear suits and dress correctly when you broadcast. Is that correct?
If it were correct, I certainly didn't abide by that ruling. On one occasion, in fact, we did have a slight problem on 390 that the wartime paint finish was flaking. And when one went to the mess to have lunch or evening meal, if it was soup, it was quite annoying to have paint to flake off the ceiling and land in the soup, to which we repainted the place. And Mark, I wonder if you could just add a comment to that, because I seem to remember I took my shirt off, as we didn't have any washing facilities, and put a newspaper over me, and maybe you'd like to continue.
Well, we were always up to hijinks, fun and games, and of course it was a wonderful opportunity to paint the newspaper cape that John was wearing as he was trying to climb up a ladder and paint this wartime fort. They were terribly basic. Let me take you through to it. When John and I first arrived on the forts, if you understand, going in a fishing boat, coming alongside to receive a rope with just a wooden platform on it, and it's there static, and there is a boat doing this, and you are on the bow, and suddenly the skipper says go, and you hold on to that, you're on the platform, and you see this boat about to come up and whack you underneath, but fortunately the skippers were so professional they backed off, and then we were winched up to the top. When we got up there was the original, this is King Radio, that John and I worked on to start with. It was so basic that sort of things like the loo, for example, was a hole in the bottom of the forts. So God help any fishing boats passing underneath. But that's basically, we sat at a little bench and did our business. That was it. And then the other side of the curtain was the studio. It was absolutely bizarre. But eventually we slowly got the fort together. Each fort we took it over. There was an accommodation fort. We got the central heating going again. The original wartime generators were there. We got those working again. Everybody helped out. And the end of the day, I should think people like Roger must have had a very nice accommodation by the time we'd finished doing our work.
I had a great honour at that time, because when we actually got 4 loos, I actually was privileged to cut the tape, and great cheers from all on board.
Yes, it was indeed pure luxury by the time I got to 390, because I'd been on Radio 270, which was a grotty little ship in the North Sea off the coast of Scarborough. And 390 was just what I needed, because, as you heard, you know, the boys in the early days had lived with all the mess and got it nice and neat and tidy, and it was quite palatial, or certainly in offshore radio terms, and it was a good deal better than Knock John had been, just in terms of day-to-day living. And what's most important, of course, is since you don't want to go off the forts onto dry land back home, you don't want to go off the forts stinking to high heaven. So you need some sort of sensible arrangement for ablutions, and seawater doesn't work. And I must say 390, I mean, it was in that respect 4-star.
So in comparison to Radio Essex, again, the living accommodation was better, presumably because you could actually look out of the window.
Yes, you could do that. You couldn't do it while you were on the air, because it was like the studio was in it was like a porter cabin within one of the towers, within the upper floor of one of the towers. But otherwise, yes, I mean, there were windows all round, and needless to say, obviously on the forts it was stable. There wasn't any rocking around or anything like that. And yes, it was pretty. These are my recollections, and maybe they're a little bit rose-coloured, rose-tinted. But I do remember that it was really comfortable and a pleasure to be there. The only damn fool thing was that they found that we were inside territorial limits and we couldn't continue. Had we been able to, I think I would have stayed there. I don't know. I might be there now, mightn't I?
Well, who knows? Who knows? Alcohol, was that allowed on the fort? I've heard again.
Well, I don't drink.
Brian, I move over to you. I've heard it wasn't allowed, but surely you and Mark and the others must have had the odd martini before starting your programmes?
I was the fort captain. I insisted no alcohol.
Okay.
I'm sure that's not correct. I've been drinking all my life. Surely there wasn't a gap when I was working and not drinking.
I must tell you.
I think we sneaked the odd bottle on, didn't we?
Yes, I think we did. I was actually interviewed by the great Mike Raven, who became actually the BBC specialist on R&B, if you remember. Sadly no longer with us. But he and his wife Mandy, who is still alive, but not here, I was auditioned by them when they put the ad in. I was working with the BBC, applied for this and met them in their apartment. I think it was in Chelsea. And everything was black. They were both dressed head to toe in black. Oh gosh! And the walls were black, the curtains were black. They showed me in their bedroom. Everything was black. It was just a black period that they were going through, I think. But Mark was a very fine broadcaster. But Mandy also broadcasts in the early days. I don't know if you remember this. She did a very dangerous horoscope program. The trouble was she made it up as she went along. Didn't keep records. And we get messages coming up from frantic listeners saying, I was listening to a horoscope from Mandy the other day and everything was bad, it was bad, it was bad. And then I got cut off, the phone went, I don't know what happened, please tell me. Well, we wouldn't know what had happened after that because we didn't have the scripts.
No.
But we'd send a nice letter to say, oh, well, fortunately, all was well. You'll have some good news next week. But it was rather sweet.
These programmes would have been pre-recorded, would they, Mandy?
She would send around on a tape.
Because a number of the programmes were pre-recorded on 390.
Do you know our biggest source of income was religion at that time? The World Tomorrow by
Ted Armstrong, that's right.
He had broadcast on hundreds of stations.
He was on Britain Radio England as well, and also Radio London, I believe.
We had 2.5 hours of him.
On Caroline.
A day, rather.
I think he had a brother, didn't he, who sometimes stepped in and was every bit as good. Because Ted Armstrong didn't use a script, and here was a real sort of Bible-bashing hot gospeler doing a half hour completely off the cuff, which at the time was really quite something, but I suppose they're all at it now.
But it was a great source of revenue for all the radio stations. They paid a lot for that. And we had to stick to playing it at exactly the right time. No comments on it whatsoever at all. If you did make a comment, and one or two did, you'd have your fort captain and he would say, "Righto, Mark, you made a comment. You're doing the Jim Reeves hour now."
I remember one occasion, it was just before I joined 390, we had Garner Ted Armstrong on Britain Radio as well. And I was having a sort of, an out of sorts of the day, and at 5:30 I just called the time, Britain Radio, it's 5:30, and pressed the button and rolled the tape, and they said, "The World Tomorrow" with Garner Ted Armstrong, and then I drank some coffee, and I sat back in the chair and looked up horrified to find that it wasn't 5:30 but 6:30 the program was supposed to go out. So I waited for about 8 minutes, and at a good spot I came in and said, "You've just heard a preview of Garner Ted Armstrong and The World Tomorrow." But it was, as I say, a very good money spinner for most of the offshore stations.
And Herbert W. Armstrong was his brother, who sometimes stepped in.
Yes.
The other main taped show, I think, was the Marie Simone Hour. Graham will remember that anyway. I don't know whether...
Yes, indeed. She, as you said, Roger, she gave some lousy horoscopes. And I remember when I had to audition for Radio 390, Jack McLaughlin, who's not here at the moment, just happened to mention that my name had come up, and in about 3.5 weeks they could be interested in me, and Peter James wanted me to meet me and give an audition, and I still have the real Australian accent at the time. So anyway, I went, met him and Josephine, and he gave me a piece of paper which also mentioned the Murray Simone Hour, and this is Britain Radio, your music station with Eve, the woman's magazine, of the air. And I read it through once, and he said, "Can you sound more English, more English?" I said, "This is Radio 390, your British family station with Eve, the woman's magazine, of the air." And then finally, no, more. And so I gave it my best shot and said, "This is Radio 390, your British family station with Eve, the woman's magazine, of the air." Yes, that's great. And then I finished out on the next tender.
Right, well, at this point, I think we'll just take a short break to listen to a couple of sound bites from the station. Unfortunately, we haven't got Graham with his English accent, but I think we have got Mark and also Roger featured.
The voice of Matt Monroe singing From Russia with Love began our request program. Thanks very much for your postcard. This is Steve French of 20 Coronation Road, Clacton-on-Sea in Essex. Nice to hear from you. Would you like us to play a request for your dear husband's birthday? So, very happy birthday to you too. And your name is Ed. And lots of love to you, Ed, from your wife Doreen and sons John and Paul. We're also including your anniversary, which is coming up in a few weeks' time. So congratulations to both of you. And the record we're going to play for you is Glenn Miller and the Moonlight Serenade. Tony Bennett singing I Left My Heart in San Francisco. If you'd like a request played on this program, the address to write to on a postcard, please, is From Me to You, BCM 390, London, WC1. If it's for a particular date, then we need at least 2 weeks' notice. We don't promise to play your request, but you never know, you might be lucky, so why not give it a try? Also, please mark your request when you'd like them played on the evening request program or the lunchtime request program, which is between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock. That address again on a postcard to From Me to You, BCM 390, London, WC1. And now it's time for just one last request, which comes from Mrs. Eva Linsell of 4 Woodland Close, Shenfield in... Introduced by David Sinclair. Radio 390, 5 o'clock. According to Israeli radio, there were no reports of any fighting during the night between Israel and Syria. At the emergency session of the Security Council, the Israeli representative also said the frontier was quiet.
Stop it. I'll explain afterwards. That's...
The council adjourned at about 10:30 this morning without fixing any time for another meeting.
I really think I ought to explain that I'd... Yeah, well, that's enough. It's all good fun and games, but really and truly, of a fragment of Roger Scott on 390, well, what had happened, basically, I'd forgotten the news, and I rushed around on the catwalks trying to get to the studio, and even though I was, 18, I suppose, by then, I was out of breath. I wasn't unfit, but long catwalks. So I ripped the news off the wire or something like that, and I'd gone skedaddling across the catwalks and up the steps and everything else. And, of course, in addition to that, 390 was a responsible station, so I thought, well, I better try my best. And, of course, I was puffing and panting and sort of making a horrible mess. And like I said earlier on, brackets, jokingly, I don't drink, so don't worry, I wasn't stewed or anything like that. I was genuinely completely out of breath. Has anybody taken any longer than me just now to explain a faux pas?
Roger, it sounded very familiar. I do remember being on Caroline, where I read the news, and I prepare it on a roll of teleprinter, and it would be lying on the floor, and you just wind it up, in Vietnam and all the various disasters and things, reading the news. And one day I'd started this 3-minute news, no disc jockey upstairs, and I smelt it. Someone had crept in and set fire to my news script, and my 3-minute news was dissolving. As I had, like you, I had run out of breath, and I was terrified. I got no news, and exactly the same situation. So I recognised it.
Talking about disasters, John, if I can bring you in here, I think you almost witnessed a near disaster involving the aerial mast and an aeroplane.
Yes, I'd been on air and finished my programme, walking across catwalk, and I looked up in the direction of London, which would be westerly, and there was this aircraft very, very close to the water flying along. It belonged to Channel Airways, and it was an Islander aircraft, which I think are about a 12-seater. Now, it looked as if it was going to ditch, so everybody who wasn't working was up on the roof of one of the forts sunning themselves. So I rushed across and said, have a look out there, there's an aircraft in trouble. And I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, no, what happens is that's the maintenance guy doing a test circuit of the aircraft, and he just comes up and nips over the catwalks and carries on. Well, from the last time he did that, unfortunately we extended a 200-foot aerial, and the guy wires going off to the adjoining forts. To this day, none of us could say whether that aircraft went between the triangulation of the aerial mast and the guy wires and the catwalk, or just went round the outside of it. Had it have literally been a few millimetres closer, it would have just brought everything down, and that would have been, well, we wouldn't have been here.
Interesting stuff. Roger, you mentioned about being out of breath, running down the catwalks, etc. I think we'll have to accept your story for that. But on a serious note, you must have been sort of quite rattling around in the forts at Red Sands, because at the height of the war, they actually housed 265 men. How many of you guys were out on the forts at its peak?
Maximum 20, I would say.
Yes, I seem to remember it was about 5 jocks at a time. I'm referring to Graham because he was more or less
about
five jocks, and most of the time we actually had a cook. That is a luxury. We had
very
a
good cook too, John.
and a couple of technicians, engineers, and so 5, 6, 7, 8 or 9 people, I suppose, at any one time. But no, we didn't feel as though we were rattling around, although obviously, I suppose boredom set in occasionally. It always does on offshore radio stations.
And the station boss, for the most part, was Ted Albury. Who of you guys would like to recount a few stories about him?
Well, I just happen to have one of his books. I don't know if most of you know that when he got out of radio, having fought valiantly, I think, to beat the law on this. So he actually engaged Sir Peter Rawlinson as our counsel, and it was taken through courts. And I think any profits made by 390 went into legal fees. But he became a top-selling author of spy and thrillers, and is listed here as being one of the 10 best spy writers in the world at that time. So I do recommend it. I've just picked this up the other day, and that's just the thing to read when I'm in Amsterdam. So Ted Albury, author. Can I just say something about I talked about Mike Raven and the audition. I'm convinced that Mike wasn't that interested in how I spoke. He was more interested when he found I'd been at sea for a few years. And the first question was, do you have a uniform? I said, yes. He said, you've still got it? I said, yes, I think so. He said, it's got some gold braid? I said, yes, some gold braid. Peak cap? Yes. He said, you're fort captain. And the reason was we were actually being threatened by the government, and the Royal Navy were being mentioned as perhaps being called in to close us down. Anyway, this was one of the things I had to keep my eye on. And one day, very foggy day, I was in my cabin, minding my own business. Bang, bang, at the door. Brian, you better come out, come out. I said, what's the matter? He said, the Navy's here. Put your uniform on. So I quickly, this isn't my lunch. Still got it, you see? Put my caps on, went out on deck.
Very good, very
effective. And there was this grey, ominous shape circling slowly around the forts and getting closer and closer. And there was a we couldn't understand what it was saying. So he got closer and closer. And we were working out, what are they saying? Are we going to blow you out of the water? Stop broadcasting, or we'll close you down. We're about to board. Whatever it was, it sounded very ominous. So we still couldn't hear shortly. We got closer, and eventually we worked it out. Could you play us a record of the Rolling Stones?
And did you?
We certainly did. They weren't the only visitors we had, though, were they, Mark? One very usually it's pretty rough out there, actually, but we had one wonderful day when the sea was calm and blue sky, and some faithful visitors came out in a high-pressure, high-full speedboat, and we were circling around and said, anyone like water skiing? Well, 2 volunteers, actually, we spent the whole afternoon, didn't we, circling around, the best day of our lives out there, I think. Wonderful. Water skiing around Red Sands Forts.
We had quite a bit of fun there. We had a visitation, I'm sure some of you are aware of it. Danger Man came, Patrick McGowan, and they filmed a particular one there. It was interesting seeing him climbing up the ladders and all over the forts, and just before he left he admitted to us that he was scared of heights. So what the hell he was doing there, I don't know. We did have some sad moments as well. And some interesting moments. Communications was interesting. We had ship-to-shore radios, and we would always we'd always talk to the lovely Doug and Kay Seymour at about 6 o'clock at night. There was a little whistle that we did, and then we'd wait for them to respond and say, 2 crates of milk, please. We need some bread. Brian needs some sugar, and that's the sort of conversation we would have. And then one day, this is an illegal broadcast. We have seized the equipment. And poor old Doug, who must have been about 60 then, I think was arrested and taken to the police station where they all knew him, of course, and let him go immediately. So such was
So our first broadcasting offence was on a handheld walkie-talkie.
Absolutely.
On the communication front, there was an additional way of getting messages across. At this particular time, I'd left 390 and was working for Radio Essex, which was the first station to go 24 hours. We didn't have the crew for it, but we went 24 hours. I used to listen, if I was working overnight, to Radio 390 at midnight, as they shut down then, and if the transmitter carrier stayed on, I knew that Mark would come on air and give me messages, because 390 did 2 weeks on, 1 week off, weather permitting. Radio Essex, I was doing 6 weeks on, 1 week off. So suddenly the station would come to life again, and hello, John. Mum and Dad send their regards. And there was this totally one-sided conversation. My being on air on Essex, I was able to reply between the records. It was Rolling Stones there, and yes, Mark, that's really interesting. But when you're next on shore, say this, that, and the other. And there was a slight problem that I think you were told off, weren't you?
Yes, I did get caught out because I was also talking to a girlfriend at the same time. Such is life that somebody heard me.
Well, the problem again there was that some listeners would, instead of listening to us, fall asleep, and they'd wake up in the middle of the night or 5 minutes after we shut down and hear this conversation. So, of course, they get onto the London office and say, what's all this? To which it had to stop, and I lost my communications link.
Just one or two eccentricities of 390. I mean, I don't know how many of you sort of remember listening to 390. Did anybody actually hear it at the time? Oh, quite a few. So you'll remember one of the eccentricities was a gong. We actually had a xylophone, like a station tuning thing, like Luxembourg had their gong, and the pre-war commercial stations had their ding-dong thing. We had a xylophone in the studio, and before each time check at the top of the hour and on the half hour, I think, we were supposed to go in some sequence or other. I don't think there was any official tune. So, any three notes, which I think is where my enjoyment of Schoenberg and possibly other avant-garde composers came from, because I started it. Bong, bing, bang, and then say Radio 390 and all that business. And the other eccentricity was because the technology was still fairly new, Spotmaster cart machines. If you weren't careful, they might jam a little bit. And Graham, do you remember when we had God Save the Queen about 13 times after midnight?
Indeed. I think it was Jack McLaughlin who'd had the evening program at that time. And he closed the station down, and of course the national anthem, God Save the Queen, was on one of those cartridges, Spotmaster cartridges. And he pressed it and went maybe to have a whiskey or whatever, kept the bottle under his bed usually. And we thought nothing more about it. I wasn't listening, but when the Daily Mirror, the newspaper, came out the next day and was sent out to the ship, what had happened was the cartridge had gone on and on and on and on and on, and the national anthem had been playing for about 20 or 30 times before anybody, Lawrence Bean, the engineer, knew that it was happening. And it was quite an embarrassing moment, I guess.
But we can see we only had 7 listens.
Now, Graham, you reminded me of a very interesting story, and John will remember this. When we started 390, they'd been testing various wavelengths and meterage, and they finally decided 390 was it. We had no crystal, so what we did was we had a special type of crystal that was powered by a 9-volt battery while the 390 crystal was being made. So this is RCA transmitter stuff.
This was a VFO, variable frequency oscillator.
That's it. That's a very variable frequency oscillator. Is that it? So yes, so there we are. We start broadcasting. We're broadcasting all day, and very slowly, all day, the wavelength goes 390, 380, 370. This is the BBC Home 390. The light program 390, right down to 200. It was wonderful. Did it all day, and nobody could get hold of us to tell us to turn the thing off.
2 D-cell batteries rectified that, and I think at the time I suggested to the engineer in charge of, rather than just putting the batteries in and switching on, put the batteries in, set it at 200, and slowly come back and bring the listeners with us.
Right, well, hopefully this isn't going to repeat 30 times, but we've got another little soundbite for you of the station.
Mijn naam is Trevor. Ik ben hoofd van Radio 390. Verschijning Weet u dat onze hoofd van postkantoor is van plan om sticht te maken. In Helleborg Holland en Belgisch luisteraars heeft gevraagd om te vragen of ze ons kunnen helpen. Ja, ik denk van wel. Als u zo willen helpen, zo u alstublieft naar het hoofd van postkantoor Aston, Londen, willen schrijven. En hem vertellen dat u veel plezier heeft van Radio 390. Dank u voor uw hulp.
Good stuff. I think he was asking for help.
It was in those days, you know, because there was no other outlet for easy listening or sweet music, whatever you like to call it, and 390 filled the gap. And I remember coming from Australia and travelling halfway around the world, it was a pleasure to be on Radio 390 because although, as you probably know, I worked on other stations, 390 is exactly the same and had more or less the same format as the last radio station where I spent 10 happy years in Australia, 2RG. And so I felt very much at home there, and hitting the gongs and saying 390 and playing Masters of the Organ or Tea Time Tunes or whatever was just fantastic.
The other thing I think which was very interesting was we weren't like the other pirate radio stations. We weren't taking the popular music of the day. We had a huge collection of famous artists, famous records, very famous picture of the music industry right the way from the 30s. So it could be Cab Calloway, it could be Burt Camford. What a fabulous band that was.
Indeed.
We'd have never have heard these bands. I've left some archives outside with a letter from Frank Chaxfield, who had a wonderful orchestra, who thanked me for playing one of his songs. There were great songs. I mean, the Gershwins. I married them, by the way, George and I, at one stage in my early career, till I realised they were brothers. But superb fun, and we'd have never have heard these records had we not forced to play them. But that was part of the format for Radio 390. It's completely different, and suddenly you find these wonderful pieces of music that you didn't know existed.
Certainly when I was 390, we had the luxury of properly produced programs. That is to say, you know, having the music selected by a producer. And in fact, one of my jobs, apart from on air, was to compile the programs. They were programs. They weren't like 3-hour sequences. There's, as Graham mentioned, Masters of the Organ, Intermezzo, and this, that, and the other. And so we'd sort of select the music and put them on a bench with the running order. And so in effect, as I say, I that was one of the things that I did apart from on-air work, was producing other programs, not shows, programs, because Intermezzo was half an hour of classical music every afternoon. The sad thing was that, yes, that was one of the things on the odd occasion I as a producer, I had to compile, but I didn't know anything about classical music. That was one of the questions I was never asked before I went out to the station. Do you know anything about classical music? The answer at that time was nothing. So I would select just 30 minutes worth of classical music to fill that half-hour gap, but I had no idea whether or not the music would clash, or whether it was appropriate, or whether there was a theme or not. So some of the real classical music fans who listened to Intermezzo 3:30 in the afternoon were probably horrified by what they were hearing. Possibly, I don't know, Boulez followed by Beethoven, followed by Webern or something like that. And it was all my well, not all my. I wasn't the only producer, but there was Stephen West was also a producer. Can you remember any others, Graham? There was David Barclay, wasn't there?
Peter Barclay was.
Peter Barclay, that's right. Yeah,
record librarian. That's right.
Yeah,
and of course we mustn't forget our other members of like John, our fantastic cook, who was one of the mainstays of being on the forts, because we all had to eat. And he used to produce some of the most fantastic meals you could ever imagine, especially the regular English roast dinner on Sunday with all the trimmings. Hard to not say no to that. It was really fantastic.
Could I mention something quite different that 390 did, and this was real pioneering? We actually created what we think was the first serious business program on radio called The Voice of Business, which went out 5 nights a week with an omnibus at the weekend. And we must have interviewed something like 1,000 companies in the time we were on air. And that was handled by myself and Dominic Lafoe, who sadly should have been here, but he died in June of this year, but had promised to come previously, hadn't he? Dominic and I worked very closely, but we worked with somebody else who was the original and the first person ever to be seen on television in the world, and his name is, can anyone remember? Because I've just forgotten. He had the most wonderful voice, and he used to do our links on the various items. And
not Mitchell, was it?
Leslie Mitchell,
yes.
Who was the person who actually closed down the BBC station when the Second World War started. He actually closed it down. And he was the first person we heard again, I think it was 7 years later, before they actually started BBC. And he said, as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, this is the BBC. Anyway, that was interesting then. And we produced these programmes, I forget how many, I think it was about a year of them, and made a lot of very useful comment. And we had lots of companies that were very proud that they had this choice of going on air. Sadly for me, it meant I couldn't be out on Red Sands. We worked from shore, obviously, from the offices in Victoria. And then later on we went to, Dominic had his own office, which we turned into a studio. And I remember Dave Allen, who, again, should have been here, but is fit and well, but not here. He came out with all the equipment and helped us set up this very nice studio in Dominic's office, which was just off Buckingham Gate. And Dominic later on became my best man. I'll just tell you this because this is another link. Only last year, shortly after Voice of Business finished, I was doing some filming, and I filmed a programme. I don't know if any of you have heard of Doctor Who. Anyone heard of Doctor Who? Fairly famous programme around the world, and I had a rather small part, but I met this lovely young lady who had a major part in it, and a few months later we were married. So I owe a lot to Doctor Who, and it's only last year that we were told that the outside, our series was to do with monsters in the ocean attacking these people on an oil rig. We couldn't get an oil rig, or they couldn't get an oil rig to let us film on it. So eventually Red Sands Fort was chosen. And I didn't know this till last year, that all those years ago we had this very strong link with Red Sands, and there's some wonderful shots of the forts being used for that. None of the crew, none of the cast actually filmed on it. It was just outside broadcast shots. The rest were in studio.
We will take some questions at the end, but there's one guy in the audience quite keen to say something now. So.
I've been wanting to ask this question for years because I've been trying to complete my collection of station themes and so on. And I understand that the theme tune of 390 was On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, but popular legend is that this may have been Mantovani in its orchestra, but I've never been able to tie that. I wondered if the panel could finally put to bed what were the theme tunes that you used and who played on them.
It's the Sentimental Orchestra. Telecast Orchestra with Sentimental. We're playing that at the end.
The Telecast Orchestra?
The Telecast Orchestra. So there was a search for this tune for 30 years going on.
Well, a guy called Chris Minter bugged the hell out of me for a while, wanting to know, to get to the bottom of it. And when I couldn't get a proper answer for it, it was quite disappointing. So, Martin, I'm very grateful.
May I please just...
Yeah, please do.
That's the one.
Telecast Orchestra.
What wonderful radio station you created.
Thank you. Interesting.
This is Radio 390, closing down.
We trust that you've enjoyed our programmes today and that you'll join us again tomorrow. We'll be back on the air at 6:30 in the morning with our first programme of the day, Morning Melody. Till then, we wish you a peaceful night and a pleasant and happy day tomorrow. So from us all here on Radio 390, good night everyone, good night.
Wonderful, wonderful memories. I wanted to say something. We had a terrific piece of PR that really helped us, and that was we got hold of an Australian soap, a cereal, a daily cereal. I think it was called Dr. Paul, and what was really interesting was that we played episode number 1, and the people in Europe were on episode number 300 and something, so they were keen to hear the first episode and hear how this Dr. Paul started up, and it was very popular.
Well, it just went on and on and on, and it was a Grace Gibson production, actually. She was an American entrepreneur in recording radio plays and what have you. She came from the States and set up in Sydney, and one of her productions was Dr. Paul, which ran on, out of the few hundred Australian radio stations commercially, it must have been on just about at least 200 of those stations every day, usually about 10 o'clock in the morning for the housewives, but also, of course, on 390. And I had it on 2RG before I left, and we're up to maybe 1,000 episode. I don't think it ever really finished. It was like... can you say today the Australian version of Neighbours or Coronation Street in Britain? They go on and on and on, you know.
John, I can see you holding in your hand a piece of paper, a la Neville Chamberlain. What have you got there?
Funnily enough, a piece of paper. It's a script. Radio 390 was obviously supported by commercial advertising, and this is a script for a commercial for a magazine called Ravalli, which the script was applicable from the 1st of October through until the 3rd of October. Now, due to bad weather conditions, unlike having a boat at sea, you could get a tender alongside a boat in a rough sea, but the fort you couldn't, because it would smash up against the side and you'd lose the boat and probably lose the fort as well. Anyway, Sheldon J., who was our sort of fort coordinator, rushed into the studio as they'd managed to throw this or container to the fort. And he rushed in and said, right, when that record finishes, read this, because it's got about a couple of hours lifespan left in it before the magazine comes off the shelves. To which I thought, what can I do? I've got 2 turntables and a mixer desk. 1 turntable's about to finish. There's nothing queued up on the next one, so for continuity I've got to queue something up. And I thought, right, I haven't got enough hands for this. The microphone hung from the ceiling, the cable went across the ceiling and then came down in front of the studio window. And there was a windowsill there, so the logical thing was to put the script on the windowsill with the microphone cable in front of it to contain it. And sure enough, that seemed to work, because the music ended and I said, that's the kind of music I like. It's got something for everybody. That's why I like Ravalli too. Ravalli's a real family weekly, packed with short stories, features, cartoons and pictures. This week, the paper fell down. And I looked on the floor and I thought, well, I can't reach that. So I thought, better sort of say something. Well, this week there'll be lots of interesting things in Ravalli and really exciting. Yeah. I left the station on October the 6th as the sacrificial lamb for that one.
You mentioned Sheldon J., and I believe his son was due to come. Is he here?
No, yes. Jack McLaughlin also. Jack was due to come also, yes. Brian. But,
no, I see. Okay.
Jack McLaughlin.
I mailed him several times, but he didn't reply anymore. So
no, I see. Okay. Can I just carry on the story that Mark was telling about remember, Mark was telling us about the visit of Danger Man on the forts to film a story about a pirate radio station, and he was the jockey. And you're absolutely right. He hated coming on board, but he had the courage to do it. You know, if you have fear and conquer it, that's real heroism actually. But I spotted the whole of the film crew on the one fort we never used. The alleged use for this, it was going to be restructured and decorated for the directors as a weekend pad. That was the story, wasn't it? And we weren't allowed to go on there. But it was perfectly safe. But I spotted the whole film crew over there. There must have been a dozen of them, mustn't there? Other actors and the film people. And I got the megaphone and called across them. And I said, "You are in a very, very dangerous place. That fort is condemned. The catwalk you have to join us on is also condemned. I want you to come back one at a time and very, very slowly." And it was very, I mean, we used to run across this thing, but it was really, to see Danger Man, you know, who had conquered everything, petrified, white as a sheet, holding on the ropes and going across, was worth it, wasn't it? We really enjoyed that. Felt we got our own back.
Was it just the external shots in Radio Jolly Roger, the Danger Man episode that were filmed at Red Sands, or were the sequences in the generator room and the,
I don't know about
the
generator
studio?
room, but certainly in the studio, yes.
Yeah, no, they've taken advantage of some of the studio and things we had. Yeah. Generator rooms, I'm sure, because it just made sense. Very easy for them to film it, but it was climbing up and down, which was interesting, and it was quite dangerous, really. I mean, we did things like I can remember laying a walkie-talkie, you know, rather like a baby alarm. We had one speaker in the studio block, and the other one was across the water, this piece of wire, to another little speaker in the living quarters. And as I was connecting it up, it suddenly was like an arc weld. This huge sparks flying off the metalwork, and you could hear the radio signal coming through this wire. So it was a very dangerous place to be, but there we are. We enjoyed it.
Indeed. Dangerous places. Mentioned the Navy circling the fort, but were any of you guys on board at the time? Your neighbours at Shivering Sands, Radio City, were raided?
No, it wasn't. No.
Well, I was on Radio Essex at the time that happened, and of course, Shivering Sands was further away from Knockjohn than from Red Sands, but yeah, we sort of saw the helicopters and the commotion and what have you, and of course that was the final nail in the coffin of offshore radio, wasn't it?
Well, it was indeed. For the audience, and obviously I wasn't there at the time, but the story I heard was that when the raiders went out, they got their bearings wrong, and they actually turned up at Red Sand Towers rather than Shivering Sands, threatening all sorts of things in estuary English. They weren't allowed on board, and various missiles were thrown by people speaking with very good English accents. And whether it was the English accents or things being thrown at them, that they did relent and disappear, presumably off to Shivering Sands. But I guess life on the forts, you could say, never had a dull moment.
Well, we had quite a lot of experience of actually the military coming to us. I mean, Micah Hearn on Radio Caroline's the famous one, when the Fleet Air Arm came in and they were at the height of the deck on the Miamigo, flying past, waving to us. And of course, Mike's on air and all he hears is the sound, whereas we're all up on deck waving. And in true style, Mike goes, "Mother of Jesus, they sent the Air Force out to bomb us." So, of course, they were stopped from ever coming near the Caroline again, which was an awful shame. But such was life. But we did have some rather tragic things. We had a ship that sank very close to us in the fog. There was a collision. I can't remember whether it hit a sandbank but there was serious loss of life. And we had our tender, the fishing boat was out there, and they were collecting bodies, which was a terrible, terrible situation. A very strange law we found. They had one of the bodies was behind the tender, and they couldn't actually bring the body onto the boat, because if they did that, they then became responsible for all the burial costs, the funeral costs. So they had to leave this body in the water and tow it back to the harbour, which was Trevor. And I was a young man then, and I still remember that with horror, total disrespect.
Radio 390 closed down on the 28th of July 1967, pretty much a couple of weeks before the passing of the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, which saw the rest of the pirate stations apart from Caroline. Graham, I think you stayed on Red Sands, though, after closure, in a sort of caretaker capacity.
Well, I was there for a short time, yes, and the last program, Tea Time Tunes, was going out, and we all knew the inevitable may be coming up, and Edward Cole came into the studio. I was just finishing Tea Time Tunes and was about to go into a news bulletin, and we had Chris Clark's On the Scene programmed on tape, ready to go out. Edward came in and said, "Graham, we have to stop now." And he took over the chair and finally announced the close down of 390.
And I think we have that recording on tape now.
You're in tune with Radio 390, Britain's family station. The time now is 5 o'clock. And this is a 390 newscast. Here are the news headlines read by Graham Gill. In Aden, 3 Arabs were shot dead by British troops on the steps of a mosque in the Crater district this morning, just after grenades had been thrown at a patrol of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. On those are the news headlines. The next news from this station will be tonight at 9 o'clock. It's now 1 minute past 5.
The directors and staff of Estuary Radio Limited very much regret that due to an injunction imposed in the High Court today at the request of the Post Office, Radio 390 is now required to cease broadcasting. We should like to express our immense appreciation to the millions of listeners who have always supported us during the past 2 years, and to our many struggles to stay on the air. It is very disappointing to all of us that we aren't able to continue to provide you with the programs you enjoy, but perhaps one day we'll be allowed to do so again. Until then, on behalf of Mr. Nye, our London office, the relief staff and everybody here, I should like to say goodbye.
Yes, a very sad time.
Since 3 years. That was Edward, wasn't it? Yeah. Great guy.
We should all stand up for the next one.
Did you in the studio?
No.
Radio 390, gone but not forgotten. One of the guys who had very much hoped to be here today was John Ross Barnard, former senior announcer on Radio 390. Sadly, he hasn't been able to make it with us. He's recently had a fairly serious operation, and I'm sure you'll all join with me in wishing him well. But Mark would just like to say a few words.
Yes, actually, that's exactly what I wanted to say. He phoned me a couple of days ago and he sounded so disappointed. He really wanted to be here, but he's not been well. I think he's been in hospital, and he sends his best. He loved broadcasting, particularly on 390. He was a great chum. We had a lot of fun, and of course he went on to broadcast all over. So he's sadly missed, but hopefully he'll make it next time.
Right, we will take a couple of questions, but first of all, just a quick few words from you guys telling us what you got up to after your days on 390.
You mean after the days? Well, for me, as you said, we were caretaking myself, Lawrence Bean and Roger for several days after the station closed down, and I came back on the tender with Roger and Lawrence, and I went back to my flat in Dulwich. My visa was 4 days overdue because we were supposed to get them stamped back and forth every crossed from Whitstable shore to the forts. And the British authorities made a problem about it, and so I had to leave Britain. However, as it turned out, I had had a letter from my mother in Australia, because I had a Dutch stepfather, that I should go and visit that part of the family there. So that's how I finished up, leaving Britain and going to Holland, and that was the end of 390, sadly, for me.
Mark?
I'm conscious of the time, so Martin. Very briefly, I broadcast till the end of 1967. I went on to Radio Caroline North, as some of you know, and then I stopped broadcasting altogether. I did a few discotheques and things like that, but I started working for an advertising agency. They wanted me because I understood about commercial advertising, radio advertising, but sadly that wasn't to be in the United Kingdom for at least 10 years. But very briefly, I started my own company, an ad agency, and by some extraordinary coincidence, I met some couple of financial directors. They were bankers, who I thought they wanted us to help them with the marketing of their banking products. Said, no, we're in shipping finance. So the first people I met were Weissmuller, and then Schmidt, and then I worked for Ned Lloyd and Lips, the propeller people here, all these names that I already knew from my work. And in fact, a little story I just told one of my friends here from Swedish Radio. I was invited to Panama Day by the ambassador, Hugo Torrijos, to the Court of St. James in London. So the Panamanian ambassador invited me there. And, hello, Pat, how are you? And there, sitting in the corner, is Ronan O'Reilly. Hugo, I said, how do you know this man? What's he doing here? What are you doing here, Ronan? He said they were both Panamanian registered vessels, weren't they, you silly idiot? So I've been in shipping ever since. I'm still a consultant to governments and others, and come across frequently to here and other maritime centres, and enjoying it still.
Brian?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I stayed in radio and then developed into television, and was fortunate enough to be asked to present quite a lot of programmes on BBC. My one claim to fame, I think, was when I was auditioned for a job in Bristol that was occupied before me by Jonathan Dimbleby, who's a big name in UK. Fortunately I was chosen, and I had a year in Bristol which was excellent, and one of the benefits of that was I used to get phone calls from Edward Cole, whose voice we just heard, because the Bristol Channel is a very good place for radio waves, and he was able to hear us working in Cardiff with the BBC there, so we had a few chats. And then I went on. I for a while was called the it was a programme called After 7 and After 8. And I was the man who used to go around London doing all the exciting interviews. And my son has never forgiven me for interviewing John Lennon and not keeping the tape. Okay. Oh, can I just add one thing? But now I still have connections, because I have a company called Catalyst World Class, and we provide speakers and entertainers and to some extent musicians for major events around the world. So we have people like Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, and people like Michael Portillo, the politician, and all sorts of top names who we provide work for in the way of corporate events and so on. That's what we do now. So if there are any potential speakers here who really have a story to tell, I don't mean just about broadcasting, but if you're a wonderful brain surgeon with research to talk about, come and see me.
I might be a potential speaker, I don't know. After 390 and after offshore radio, well, after 390 particularly, like everybody else, I toddled along to the BBC. None of us believed in Radio 1 or Radio 2 because we thought it was a very pale imitation indeed, or was going to be a pale imitation indeed of what had gone. But nonetheless, we put our true beliefs aside, and we must work on Radio 1, must work on Radio 2. And the upshot of that was, to this day, I'm still on the Radio 1 / Radio 2 list of persons with suitable broadcasting voices suitable for indeed broadcasting. So one of these days I'll get in touch with them. I mean, I'm 62 now, so they'll probably say, hey, too late, mate, you're too old. But I'm still on your list. Have you no suitable thing for me at all? But just very, very briefly, that obviously didn't come to pass. So Caroline North, then that finished, and then to TV continuity announcing, and then local radio. There was RNI, and lots and lots and lots of voiceovers. And technically, I'm still a voiceover, but I did go seriously out of fashion. No idea why. I mean, you know, I don't speak estuary English. I don't sound young. I don't sound ridiculous. How could I have possibly gone out of fashion? But if anybody wants me to advertise anything, I will advertise anything, and used to.
Finally, John.
And finally, I took the route of doing discotheques. I got involved with some film people and used to do voiceovers for sales and documentary films, and eventually wound up in the film industry full-time on special effects. For a film, Medusa Touch, we flew a 747 into a tower block in London that now, looking back, isn't that original, but we did it first. We made a monster burst out of John Hurt's chest in the first Alien, and lots of actors and actresses wanted to hit me because about 2 gallons of blood hit them, and they weren't that happy. But film industry, not so much of that now. Last big film I worked on was building the Enigma machines for Enigma film. And other than that, I dabble in radio broadcasting from an AM station, an internet station based at Reading College in Berkshire, which, full circle, rather like the old days, I had a phone message come through on arrival here. If you're available, could you nip over to Reading as the computer's crashed and there's nobody who can put it on? So we're off air this afternoon.
Right, well, I think we've just about crashed now. Martin, have we got time for a couple of questions, or one question? Anyone with a hand up quickly? We've obviously covered everything, guys. Oh, we have.
What are you doing the Red Sands for?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Project Red Sand, very, very briefly, is a charitable trust aimed at preserving the red sand towers for posterity. All you need to know is log on to our website, www.projectredsand.com, or just put Project Red Sand into your favourite search engine, and you'll see lots of pictures, lots of news. The upshot of it is that we only have narrow time frame weather-wise to get out there and do work. It ain't easy, it's very expensive, but we've got a lot of irons in the fire for 2011, which, with fingers very firmly crossed, and pretty well everything else, we're hoping to get some reasonable money in the bank next year, which may enable us to do more work on the towers. But it really all hinges on money, like pretty well everything else in this world. But we're aiming to concentrate our efforts on one of the 7 towers and see where we go from there. Check out the website. But in closing, I'd just like to ask you guys to show your support and thanks to our panel here for turning up and telling us some really interesting stories of Radio 390.